My name is Jessica Morgan, and this is the story of how my stepmother's unforgivable cruelty led me to discover a truth so shocking that it destroyed her life and gave me justice I never could have imagined. This story begins with loss, but it ends with the kind of poetic justice that proves sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales when you least expect it. When I was 16, my mother Sarah died after a 2-year battle with breast cancer. She was only 42, vibrant, and full of life until the disease stole everything from her piece by piece. Mom was my best friend, my confidant, and the person who taught me that kindness and strength weren't mutually exclusive. Losing her felt like losing half of myself. Dad was devastated by Mom's death. For months after her funeral, he barely functioned. He would sit in his chair staring at old photo albums, forgetting to eat, forgetting to go to work, forgetting that he still had a daughter who needed him. I essentially became the parent in our household, managing bills, grocery shopping, and trying to keep our lives from completely falling apart. About 18 months after Mom died, Dad started dating again. I understood his loneliness, and honestly, I was relieved to see him engaging with life again instead of disappearing into his grief. When he introduced me to Linda, she seemed nice enough. She was a widow herself, having lost her husband in a car accident several years earlier. She appeared to understand loss and seemed genuinely caring toward both Dad and me. Linda was different from my mother in almost every way. Where Mom had been warm and spontaneous, Linda was controlled and methodical. Where Mom had encouraged my creativity and independence, Linda seemed to prefer structure and compliance. But she made Dad happy, and after watching him suffer for so long, that felt like enough. Dad and Linda got married when I was 19 during my sophomore year of college. The wedding was small and tasteful, and Linda seemed to make a genuine effort to include me in their new family dynamic. She never tried to replace my mother, which I appreciated, and she supported my education and career goals. For several years, our blended family worked reasonably well. Linda kept Dad grounded and helped him rebuild his life after Mom's death. She was efficient at managing household affairs and created stability that Dad needed. I lived on campus during college, and then moved to my own apartment after graduation, so most of my interactions with Linda were during holidays and family gatherings. But after Dad's sudden heart attack 3 years ago, everything changed. Dad died at age 58, completely, without warning. He had always been healthy and active, and his death shocked everyone who knew him. One morning he was drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, and 6 hours later he was gone. The doctors said it was a massive coronary event that would have been fatal regardless of medical intervention. Losing Dad so soon after losing Mom was devastating. At 27, I was suddenly an orphan, left to navigate grief and practical arrangements entirely on my own. Linda seemed equally shattered by Dad's death, and we supported each other through the funeral and immediate aftermath. What I didn't expect was how dramatically Linda's behavior toward me would change once Dad was no longer there to witness our interactions. Within weeks of the funeral, Linda became cold and dismissive toward me. She stopped returning my phone calls, excluded me from decisions about Dad's estate, and made it clear that she considered me an unwelcome presence in her life. When I tried to discuss this change with her, she told me bluntly that her relationship with me had only existed because of Dad, and that she saw no reason to maintain a connection now that he was gone. I was hurt, but tried to respect Linda's wishes for distance. I focused on my own grief and healing, and assumed that eventually we would find a way to maintain some kind of civil relationship based on our shared love for Dad. The situation escalated dramatically 6 months after Dad's death, when I went to the house to collect some of my mother's belongings that I had left in storage there. Among those belongings was the most precious item I owned, my mother's ashes. After Mom's cremation, Dad and I had decided to keep her ashes in a beautiful wooden urn that we displayed in our living room. The urn was engraved with Mom's name, birth and death dates, and a quote from her favorite poem. For years, that urn had been the centerpiece of our home, a way of keeping Mom's presence with us even after she was gone. When Dad remarried, I offered to take the urn to my apartment, but Dad insisted that it remain in the house. He said that the house had been Mom's home and that her ashes belonged there as long as he lived there. Linda never objected to this arrangement and seemed to understand the emotional significance of keeping the urn in its familiar place. After Dad's death, I had assumed that I would take the urn with me when I collected my mother's other belongings. The urn belonged to me legally and emotionally, and I wanted to create a shrine for both my parents in my own home. When I arrived at the house that Saturday morning, Linda met me at the door with an attitude that was hostile from the moment I stepped inside. She handed me a small cardboard box and told me it contained everything of mine that remained in the house. When I asked about my mother's urn, Linda's response left me speechless. She told me she had thrown the urn away the previous week. I thought I had misheard her. I asked her to repeat what she had said, and Linda calmly explained that she had disposed of my mother's ashes because she didn't want the remains of a dead woman cluttering up her living space. I felt like the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. I begged Linda to tell me she was joking or that I had misunderstood what she was saying. But she looked me directly in the eyes and confirmed that she had thrown my mother's ashes in the garbage and that the garbage had already been collected. When I asked her how she could do such a thing, Linda's response was even more shocking than her original admission. She told me that my mother was garbage and that she belonged in the garbage where Linda had put her. I have never experienced rage like what I felt in that moment. This woman had desecrated my mother's remains and was describing the most important person in my life as trash. I started crying and screaming, demanding to know how she could be so cruel and heartless. Linda remained completely calm throughout my breakdown. She told me that she had tolerated my mother's presence in her house for as long as Dad was alive, but that she refused to share her living space with a dead woman who meant nothing to her. She said that my mother had been weak and pathetic for dying of cancer, and that she was glad to finally be rid of her. I threatened to call the police and report her for destroying my property, but Linda laughed and said that proving she had thrown away an urn would be impossible, and that no one would care about the complaints of a grieving daughter who couldn't accept that her parents were both dead. She then ordered me to leave her house and told me never to return. She said that I was no longer welcome in her life and that she never wanted to see or hear from me again. I left that house in complete shock and devastation. Not only had Linda destroyed the physical remains of my mother, but she had done it with such calculated cruelty that I couldn't comprehend how I had misjudged her character so completely. That night, I called the police to report what Linda had done, but the responding officer explained that proving destruction of property would be nearly impossible without witnesses or physical evidence. He took my report but warned me that criminal charges were unlikely without more substantial proof of wrongdoing. I spent the next several days trying to figure out how to respond to Linda's actions. I consulted with lawyers about civil litigation, but they told me that monetary damages for destroying cremated remains were typically minimal and that the emotional distress would be difficult to prove in court. I was beginning to think that Linda would face no consequences for her cruelty when I remembered something Dad had mentioned shortly before his death. Dad had always been a private person who kept his thoughts and feelings to himself, but in the months before his heart attack, he had been acting strangely. He seemed anxious and distracted, often lost in thought during conversations. Several times I had caught him staring at Linda with an expression I couldn't interpret, something between sadness and disappointment. About 2 months before he died, Dad had mentioned that he was keeping a personal journal to help him process some complicated feelings he was experiencing. He said that writing helped him think through difficult situations and that he found it therapeutic to record his thoughts and observations. I had never seen this journal, but Dad's comment stayed with me because it was so unlike him to discuss his emotional process so openly. After Linda's revelation about destroying Mom's ashes, I realized that Dad's journal might contain information about his relationship with Linda that could be relevant to understanding the situation. If Dad had documented problems or concerns about Linda's behavior, that information might help me understand how she could have committed such a heartless act. I knew that Dad kept important documents and personal items in a home office that was located in the basement of the house. During my childhood, that office had been Dad's private retreat where he paid bills, worked on projects, and stored family documents and memorabilia. The problem was that the office was in Linda's house, and she had made it clear that I was no longer welcome there. But I also knew that Linda worked as a real estate agent and spent most weekday mornings showing properties to clients. If I could access the house while she was away, I might be able to find Dad's journal and learn whether it contained information that could help me understand or address what Linda had done. I'm not proud of what I did next, but desperate grief sometimes leads to desperate decisions. I had kept a spare key to the house from before Dad's death, and Linda had apparently forgotten to ask for it back or change the locks. On a Tuesday morning when I knew Linda would be at work, I used that key to enter the house and search Dad's office. The basement office was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood, filled with filing cabinets, bookshelves, and the old wooden desk where Dad had spent countless hours managing family business. I began systematically searching through drawers and files, looking for anything that resembled a personal journal or diary. I found the journal hidden in the bottom drawer of Dad's desk, underneath a stack of old tax returns. It was a simple leather-bound notebook that covered roughly the last 8 months of Dad's life. The entries were written in Dad's familiar handwriting and were dated chronologically from about 6 months after his marriage to Linda until just 2 weeks before his death. Reading that journal was one of the most disturbing and heartbreaking experiences of my life. The early entries revealed that Dad had serious concerns about Linda's character and motives that he had never shared with me. He documented instances of Linda being cruel to service workers, dismissive toward his friends, and manipulative in her interactions with family members. But the later entries revealed something far more sinister. Dad had apparently discovered that Linda had been systematically stealing money from his accounts and hiding assets in her own name. The journal documented his investigation into financial irregularities that he had noticed in bank statements and credit card bills. Dad had discovered that Linda was using his credit cards for personal purchases, transferring money from his accounts to accounts she controlled, and had even taken out loans using his identity without his knowledge. The journal revealed that Dad had been gathering evidence of Linda's financial crimes for months, consulting with lawyers and accountants to understand the scope of her theft and fraud. He had been preparing to confront her and demand restitution when his heart attack occurred. But the most shocking entries in the journal dealt with Linda's treatment of my mother's memory and belongings. Dad had documented multiple instances of Linda making cruel comments about my mother, including statements that my mother had been weak and pathetic, that she was glad my mother was dead, and that she resented having to share the house with reminders of a dead woman. The journal revealed that Linda had been pressuring Dad to get rid of my mother's ashes for months before his death. She had repeatedly told him that keeping the urn was morbid and unhealthy, and that it prevented him from fully committing to their marriage. Most disturbingly, Dad had written that he suspected Linda had already made plans to dispose of my mother's ashes as soon as he was no longer around to stop her. The final entries in the journal showed that Dad had been considering divorce proceedings against Linda. He had discovered the extent of her financial crimes, was horrified by her cruelty toward my mother's memory, and had realized that his marriage was based entirely on Linda's deception and manipulation. Dad had written that he was planning to file for divorce immediately after consulting with his lawyer the following week. He had also written that he intended to have Linda prosecuted for identity theft and fraud, and that he wanted to ensure she could never hurt me or dishonor my mother's memory again. The last entry in the journal, written just days before Dad's heart attack, contained a heartbreaking apology to both my mother and me. Dad wrote that he was ashamed of bringing someone like Linda into our family and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for the pain his poor judgment had caused. Reading those words, I realized that Dad had died knowing the truth about Linda, but without the opportunity to protect me or get justice for her crimes. But now I had the evidence that Dad had been gathering, and I had his documentation of Linda's character and criminal behavior. More importantly, I had proof that Linda had been planning to destroy my mother's ashes long before she actually did it, which demonstrated premeditation and malicious intent. I photographed every page of the journal and made copies of the financial documents that Dad had collected as evidence of Linda's theft and fraud. Then I returned everything to its original location and left the house before Linda returned from work. That afternoon, I returned to the police station with Dad's journal and requested to speak with a detective about filing charges against Linda for financial crimes and destruction of property. Detective Maria Santos reviewed Dad's journal and the supporting financial documents with careful attention. She explained that the evidence Dad had gathered appeared to show a clear pattern of identity theft, credit card fraud, and embezzlement that could result in serious criminal charges. More importantly, Detective Santos explained that Dad's documentation of Linda's statements about my mother and her plans to destroy the ashes could be used to prove premeditation and malicious intent in the destruction of my mother's remains. The detective told me that the combination of financial crimes and destruction of human remains could result in felony charges that carried significant prison time and financial penalties. 2 days later, Detective Santos and 2 other officers arrested Linda at her real estate office on charges including identity theft, credit card fraud, embezzlement, and desecration of human remains. The arrest was executed during the middle of a busy workday, in front of Linda's colleagues and clients. Detective Santos told me later that Linda's initial shock and denial quickly gave way to panic when she realized the police had extensive documentation of her crimes. Linda's first reaction was to claim that Dad had given her permission to use his accounts and credit cards, but the detective pointed out that the pattern of financial activity had been carefully concealed from Dad and that his journal documented his discovery and investigation of her fraud. When confronted with Dad's journal entries about her plans to destroy my mother's ashes, Linda tried to claim that she had disposed of the urn accidentally during household cleaning. But Dad's documentation of her repeated statements about wanting to get rid of my mother's remains made it clear that her actions were deliberate and malicious. The prosecution of Linda's case moved forward quickly because Dad's journal provided such comprehensive evidence of her crimes and motives. The district attorney charged her with multiple felonies and sought the maximum sentences allowed under state law. Linda's defense attorney tried to argue that she was overcome with grief after Dad's death and that her actions reflected emotional instability rather than criminal intent. But Dad's journal entries clearly showed that Linda's criminal behavior had been ongoing throughout her marriage and had escalated over time rather than beginning after his death. The financial investigation revealed that Linda had stolen nearly $60,000 from Dad's accounts over the course of their marriage. She had used his identity to open credit cards, take out loans, and make major purchases that she had hidden from him. The pattern of theft was systematic and sophisticated, requiring significant planning and deception. Linda ultimately pleaded guilty to avoid a trial that would have exposed even more details about her crimes and character. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution for the money she had stolen. But the criminal prosecution was only part of Linda's downfall. The publicity surrounding her arrest destroyed her real estate career and social reputation. Her colleagues and clients learned that she was a convicted felon who had stolen from her dying husband and desecrated his first wife's remains. The real estate agency where she had worked terminated her employment immediately, and her professional license was revoked. Linda also faced civil liability for the theft and emotional distress she had caused. I filed a lawsuit seeking damages for the financial crimes, the destruction of my mother's ashes, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The civil case was settled out of court for a substantial sum that included punitive damages reflecting the particularly cruel nature of Linda's actions. Most importantly, the investigation into Linda's crimes revealed information that helped me recover what she had destroyed. Detective Santos's investigation discovered that Linda had lied about when and how she had disposed of my mother's ashes. Security camera footage from the waste management company showed that Linda had actually taken the urn to a private crematory service rather than throwing it in household garbage. The crematory owner initially denied any knowledge of Linda or my mother's ashes, but when faced with security footage and the threat of criminal charges for improper handling of human remains, he admitted that Linda had brought him the urn and asked him to dispose of the contents. Fortunately, the crematory owner had been suspicious of Linda's request and had refused to destroy the ashes. Instead, he had stored the urn in his facility while trying to determine whether Linda had the legal right to dispose of someone else's remains. 3 months after Linda's arrest, Detective Santos called me with news that seemed impossible after everything I had been through. My mother's ashes had been recovered intact, and the urn had never been damaged or desecrated as Linda had claimed. The crematory owner turned over the urn along with documentation showing that he had never intended to destroy the ashes and had been planning to contact authorities about Linda's suspicious request. Holding my mother's urn again was an emotional experience that I struggled to describe. For months, I had believed that Mom's remains had been destroyed and that I would never be able to honor her memory in the way she deserved. Discovering that Linda had lied even about the destruction was both infuriating and deeply relieving. I was able to bring my mother's ashes home and create the memorial shrine that I had always planned. The urn now sits in a place of honor in my living room, surrounded by photos of both my parents and flowers that I change regularly. But the recovery of the ashes was only part of the justice that Linda's crimes had set in motion. Dad's journal revealed that Linda had been planning to dispose of family documents, photos, and other memorabilia that belonged to me but had been stored in the house. The police investigation led to the recovery of boxes of family items that Linda had intended to destroy or sell. Among those recovered items were letters that my mother had written to me during her cancer treatment, family photos dating back generations, and personal items that had belonged to my maternal grandparents. Linda had apparently planned to destroy these items as part of erasing any trace of my mother from the house and her life. The investigation also revealed that Linda had been telling people in her social circle that I was an ungrateful stepdaughter who had abandoned her after Dad's death. She had portrayed herself as the victim of a family conflict and had been soliciting sympathy and support based on completely false narratives about our relationship. When Linda's crimes became public, many of her friends and acquaintances reached out to me to apologize for believing her lies and to express shock at learning the truth about her character. The resolution of Linda's criminal case brought me a sense of closure and justice that I had never expected to achieve. She had not only been held accountable for her crimes, but had lost everything that she had gained through her marriage to my father. Linda served her full 4-year prison sentence and was released on parole last year. She was required to move to a different state as a condition of her parole and is prohibited from contacting me or any member of my family. I heard through legal channels that Linda is working in a minimum wage job and living in a small apartment, having lost the house, cars, and lifestyle that she had gained through her marriage to Dad. The restitution payments take most of her income, and she will be paying off her debt to my father's estate for many years to come. Today, 5 years after Linda threw away what she thought were my mother's ashes, I have built a life that honors both my parents while moving forward with my own dreams and goals. I used part of the settlement money from Linda's case, to establish a scholarship fund in my mother's name that provides financial assistance to young women pursuing careers in healthcare. The scholarship reflects Mom's own commitment to helping others and ensures that her memory contributes to positive outcomes in other people's lives. I also use Dad's journal as the foundation for a book about recognizing and protecting yourself from financial abuse in relationships. The book has helped other families identify warning signs of manipulation and theft that Dad documented so carefully in his final months. The experience taught me that sometimes the worst betrayals can ultimately lead to the most meaningful forms of justice. Linda's cruelty toward my mother's memory and her theft from my father created the evidence trail that brought about her complete downfall. Dad's journal became his final gift to me, not just the evidence I needed to get justice, but also the proof that he had recognized Linda's true character and had been working to protect me even as his own life was ending. I learned that some people are capable of cruelty that seems almost incomprehensible, but I also learned that truth and evidence have a power that can overcome even the most calculating deception. Linda thought she could destroy my mother's memory and steal my father's legacy without consequences. Instead, her crimes led to her own destruction and ensured that both my parents' legacies would be preserved and honored for generations to come. Reading Dad's journal showed me that love and protection can continue even after death, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people who aren't around to see the victory. Linda called my mother garbage and treated her ashes like trash. But in the end, it was Linda's own character that proved to be worthless, and it was my parents' love and wisdom that proved to be the most valuable inheritance of all.